Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Wolfgang, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. As an Israeli political scientist, such as myself, for me, self-determination is very much alive and kicking. And, well, one obvious reason is the fact that the Palestinians demand statehood, mainly based on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. But perhaps somewhat oddly, this also applies to the other side, to the Israeli side, which is the growing demand that we have witnessed in recent years for that Israel posed to the Palestinians, that it will be recognized by the Palestinians as a Jewish state, which obviously boils down to the question of self-determination, the self-determination of the Jewish people to their own statehood. So in a sense, I guess this is lesson number one that I want to emphasize, the fact that self-determination, contrary to what we are used to think, self-determination does not end with state being obtained. It can go further, beyond the stage of obtaining statehood. But it can also, and often does, begins before the demand for statehood. And I might have a chance to emphasize it later on. The second lesson that I get from my own Israeli perspective is the importance of the discourse on self-determination. And I think that there is a growing need to complement the usual lens through which we view the question of self-determination. And the usual lens are the legal lens, the legal viewpoint of self-determination, the moral, the philosophical perspective on self-determination, and the behavioral, the political behavior of self-determination. I think that a discursive dimension should be added to the equation of understanding what self-determination is all about. And this was one main impetus for, I would say, for us at the LISD to begin, and at this point we are in the pilot phase of a project that we call NESDI, N-E-S-D-I, which is an acronym for Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Self-Determination Index. And the purpose of that index is to construct a data set that try to decipher not political behavior of ethnic conflicts, of self-determination, as we've seen in many existing data sets, but to go for the intersubjective dimension, for the heart and minds, if you will, going into content analysis of various media resources and trying to see what people think of these various issues and to see whether we can better understand those perspectives and perhaps furthermore juxtapose them with more objective trends that we've witnessed. So what I will present to you now is a very basic chart. As I said, this is a pilot phase. And what you see here is a rather simple word count of references to self-determination in the New York Times from the late 19th century to date. And this is from the New York Times, but we have various other newspapers, and the correlation is high. So the trend is probably indicative, at least, of what is going on, and this is what we've examined so far, Western media. So there are various questions that this chart arises. What you see in the more small frames there is trying to highlight, to zoom in into certain years. So at least in that perspective, I could say that when you look at the peak after the First World War, right, the Versailles Peace Treaty, and the second high peak, the highest one, during the decolonization period, there we have plenty of topics that are being discussed. But the 3 years that I've highlighted there are ones in which one specific topic was at the core of the text and talk of self-determination, on self-determination. In 1938, that was the problem of the Sudetenland. Hitler's demand for self-determination for the German people, which means including the Sudetenland, which were populated mainly by Germans, into the Greater Germany. In 1955, that was the crisis in Cyprus. In 1982, that was the crisis in Lebanon, the first Lebanon war. And one of the interesting things that may give us a hint about the possible advantages of NESDI approach is that whereas in 1982, the discourse of self-determination, the self-determination of the Palestinian people began to rise after Israel invasion to Lebanon. In 1938 and 1955, you can actually see the rise in the discourse of self-determination before the crisis took place, which perhaps gives us a reason to believe that we may use this kind of index to even predict the rise of certain conflicts. But the main question that I want to pose before you, and I guess that I will have time more to emphasize the puzzle than to try to answer it, is the decline of self-determination, the decline of the discourse on self-determination in the last generation. And if you look at the chart, you will see it very evidently. The last decade has been, on average, the lowest point ever in the discourse on self-determination, which Wolfgang oddly corresponds with the existence of the LISD, so you'll have to give some explanation of that later on. And of course, there could be many reasons of why this decline actually took place. Why do certain political concepts actually decline? Why do they rise and why do they decline afterwards? So just to give an illustration by way of comparison, this is legitimacy. And I think this is pretty much self-evident for all of us. We have seen the way legitimacy is framed in the last generation. We talk more and more about legitimacy. Legitimacy of war, legitimacy of authority. This is a very fashionable concept. And that was the way self-determination was at the peak of the decolonization period, for example, in terms of number, even more than legitimacy today. So what would cause, for example, the decline of our usage of legitimacy in our public political discourse? Now, one evident reason for a possible decline such as this would be that the reason for the concept, the reasons for the emergence of the concept has in a way exhausted itself, right? That it has been a great success. If all authorities, if all political activities will become legitimate in our view, perhaps we will be less inclined to use the word legitimacy because it will be less problematic in a way. So this is one way to decipher why self-determination has in fact declined, because it has exhausted itself in the sense of mission accomplished. And what was the mission? We could argue that to solve the mismatch between nation and state, right? The nation-state mismatch. And we could argue, if you look at the chart, that the establishment of new states, of independent states, as a result of decolonization, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, of the former Republic of Yugoslavia, all of these were successful attempts at resolving the mismatch between nation and states, thus the decline in self-determination, in the need for self-determination. And if we look at the chart that provides a kind of correlation between the rise and fall, this is just from 1914, obviously, for the rise and fall of the discourse on self-determination with the establishment of new states, the correlation is very high. So, success, that could be one reason for the decline of self-determination. But I would argue that it is exactly the opposite. It is the flip side. It is the failure of self-determination that prompted the decline of the discourse on self-determination. And the reason I'm saying that is that basically the mismatch between nations and state in contemporary global politics hasn't been resolved. The decolonization process and the fragmentation of the former Soviet Union to various republics has not solved the question of the right of peoples, of nations, to self-determination. Most of these either decolonized countries or the new states established at the ruins of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia contains numerous nations that, at least ostensibly, could demand that self-determination, that establishment of new states. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. The mismatch still lingers, but still self-determination has declined. And I would like to briefly outline three potential reasons for that. Three potential reasons that have undermined the ethics and the ideal of self-determination as both dual, pertaining to the self and, both to the determination of the individual self as part of a people, and the self-determination of the people, of the nation, to form a state, and mutual, regarding both the self and the other. And the three main issues, and I will briefly state them, is that the self-determination of peoples have been overshadowed by the other determination by states. And I think that the quotation by Sir Ivar Jennings point to the fact. On the surface, the doctrine of self-determination seemed reasonable. Let the people decide. It was, in fact, ridiculous because the people cannot decide until someone decides who are the people. And that someone, historically historically speaking, has been the state. So it is the autodetermination of the state, as the caricature with Khrushchev in 1961 regarding Berlin shows. Sure, I'm for self-determination. I determine these things myself. And the American administration have responded in pretty much the same point. Second, the second reason is the problem of finding and defining peoples. And the two questions are, what qualifies a group to become a people? And do all peoples have the right of self-determination? And the fear that the international community is engulfed in is that we will experience a domino effect. One community will get self-determination, the other will demand it also, and also the Matryoshka doll effect. If we'll give statehood to one community, then the minority within it will also demand a state of its own. And the quotation by Woodrow attests to that. So that's the second question, the second problem, the second factor that leads to the failure of self-determination. And last but not least is the fact that we, especially in the last generation, emphasize defending existent state while denying statehood of stateless peoples. And here I point in my paper to two basic processes. One, material globalization, and the second is the ascendance of the responsibility to protect and to represent. While globalization diminishes the need for a state, it increases the need and the will, as well as the capacity to form and sustain social identity, and it augments the politics of recognition, the need to recognize, going back to the topic that I mentioned before, Israel's demand to be recognized as a Jewish state, and the responsibility to protect and to represent, which is odd in a way, because those responsibilities, ostensibly, are there to protect minorities, to help minorities. But all these minorities, when they are indeed peoples, when they are indeed nations that would like to have self-determination, are deprived of those rights precisely because of the right and the responsibility to protect and to represent. Because the state actor, the existent state actor, is endowed with this responsibility. It is the Leviathan that has the responsibility to protect those minorities, to represent those minorities. So their claims are channeled through the existent Leviathan, which often enough results in the creation of a behemoth, which was Hobbes' flip side of what the state can be like. The notion, of course, of failed states. So with this I conclude. Thank you.